The stench hits you first. Unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and human waste baking under the relentless sun. Welcome to Dodge City, 1875. That romantic image of cowboys and saloon girls? Forget it, you're about to discover why most people who came to the Wild West either died within their first year or fled back east as soon as they could afford a train ticket. The reality was dysentery, desperation, and death. Lots of death. The train screeches to a halt at what the conductor optimistically calls the Dodge City Station, though it's really just a wooden platform beside the railroad tracks, surrounded by nothing but endless prairie grass and a cluster of ramshackle buildings that look like they were thrown together by someone who'd never seen proper construction. As you step off the train, the Kansas heat hits you like opening an oven door. It's only 9 a.m., but the sun is already merciless, promising a day where temperatures will soar past 100 degrees with no relief in sight. The wind, instead of providing comfort, carries with it a cocktail of smells that makes your stomach churn. Animal dung, rotting meat, human waste, and something else you can't quite identify, but desperately hope you never encounter again. Welcome to Dodge City, Kansas, in the summer of 1875, the height of the cattle boom that Hollywood would later romanticize beyond all recognition. But standing here now, watching a drunk cowboy urinate against the side of a building while a stray dog roots through a pile of garbage, you begin to understand that the Wild West was wild primarily because it was barely civilized at all. The main street, Front Street as the locals call it, stretches before you like a scene from a nightmare. The buildings are mostly false-fronted, wooden structures designed to look impressive from the front, while hiding the fact that they're essentially shacks. Most lean at alarming angles, their boards warped and split by the extreme temperature changes that characterize the high plains. Paint is a luxury that few bother with, leaving most structures the weathered gray color of sun-bleached wood. The street itself isn't paved. Paving is an Eastern luxury that hasn't made it to places like Dodge City. Instead, it's hard-packed dirt that turns to choking dust when it's dry and impassable mud when it rains. Right now, in the summer heat, every footstep raises small clouds of dust that coat your clothes, fill your nostrils, and leave a gritty taste in your mouth. The people you see moving along the street look nothing like the clean, well-dressed actors you've seen in Western movies. These are hard-used individuals whose appearance tells the story of frontier life more clearly than any history book. The men are uniformly thin, not the lean, muscular thin of athletes, but the gaunt thinness of people who often don't get enough to eat. Their clothes are patched, dirty, and ill-fitting. Many show signs of recent violence. Black eyes, split lips, bandaged hands. The women are even more shocking to modern eyes. The few respectable women you see are prematurely aged, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their hands rough from constant manual labor. They wear simple, practical dresses that have been mended multiple times and lack any of the elaborate style you might expect from period films. The prostitutes who work in the saloons and dance halls are easier to identify, but not because they look glamorous. Quite the opposite. Many are missing teeth, show signs of disease, and bear the bruises and scars of their dangerous profession. A group of cowboys has just arrived in town after weeks on the cattle trail, and their appearance is particularly jarring. These are the men Hollywood turned into romantic heroes, but the reality is far different. They're covered in dirt and cattle dung. Their clothes so filthy they could probably stand up by themselves. Their hair is long and unkempt, their beards matted with food and dirt. They smell like animals because they've been living with animals for months, sleeping on the ground, rarely, bathing, eating whatever food they could carry or catch. One of them stumbles past you, clearly drunk, despite the early hour, and the smell that wafts from him is overwhelming. Unwashed human body, stale alcohol, tobacco, and the distinctive odor of someone who has been wearing the same clothes for months without washing them or himself. This is the reality of the cowboy life. Brutal, dirty work performed by men who were often running from something and had few other options for employment. The buildings lining Front Street tell their own story of frontier priorities. There are 8 saloons within a 2-block stretch, but only one church and no school. There's a doctor's office. Though calling it that is generous, it's really just a room above the barber shop, where a man who may or may not have medical training will attempt to treat everything from gunshot wounds to typhoid fever with the same basic tools and dubious techniques. The general store is packed with overpriced goods that had to be shipped hundreds of miles by wagon train. A simple cotton dress that might cost $2 in Chicago sells for $15 here. Sugar is $1 a pound. When it's available at all, coffee costs more than most people make in a day. Fresh fruit and vegetables are virtually unknown. Most people subsist on salt pork, beans, and whatever game they can shoot or catch. The saloons are already busy despite the early hour, filled with men who have little else to do and fewer places to do it. These aren't the elegant establishments of movie westerns, with polished brass and crystal chandeliers. They're crude wooden buildings with sawdust on the floors to absorb spilled drinks, blood, and worse, the furniture is rough and often broken. The alcohol is of questionable quality, and often watered down or adulterated with dangerous additives. The entertainment consists of gambling, drinking, and whatever companionship can be purchased from the women who work there. Violence is casual and constant. As you watch, 2 men begin arguing over a card game, and within minutes, they're throwing punches while the other patrons place bets on the outcome. Nobody tries to stop the fight. In fact, it seems to be considered entertainment. When one man pulls a knife, the crowd simply moves back to give them room, still shouting encouragement and making wagers. This is your introduction to daily life in the Wild West, a place where civilization's veneer was thin to non-existent, where survival depended on luck as much as skill, and where death could come from a dozen different sources on any given day. The romantic myths you've seen in movies were created by people who never experienced the reality of frontier life, never smelled the authentic stench of a cattle town, never watched good people die from diseases that would be easily treatable today. As you stand on the platform, wondering what you've gotten yourself into, a local resident approaches, a thin man with missing teeth and clothes that might have been washed sometime in the past month. First time in Dodge? He asks with a grin that's anything but reassuring. Well, you picked an interesting time to visit. Trail season's just getting started, which means things are about to get a whole lot more interesting around here. His definition of interesting, you're about to learn, includes levels of violence, disease, desperation, and human degradation that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the American frontier experience. Within your first hour in Dodge City, you begin to understand that the Wild West wasn't just wild. It was expensive in ways that made basic survival a daily financial struggle for most residents. The economics of frontier life created a vicious cycle where people came west hoping to improve their circumstances, but often found themselves trapped in conditions worse than what they'd left behind. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad that brought you to Dodge City charges outrageous rates for freight, knowing they have a monopoly on transportation to and from the outside world. This means that everything, absolutely everything, costs far more than it would in established eastern cities. A loaf of bread that costs 10 cents in Kansas City sells for 50 cents in Dodge. A bottle of whiskey that retails for $1 in St. Louis commands $5 here when it's available at all. The hotel where you're staying epitomizes frontier economics. The Dodge House is the finest accommodation in town, which means you're paying $3 a night for a room you share with whoever else can afford the rate. Beds that are infested with lice and bedbugs, meals that consist primarily of beans and salt pork, and the privilege of using an outhouse that serves the entire building and hasn't been cleaned in recent memory. James Dog Kelly, who owns the Alonzo Saloon and much of the property along Front Street, explains the economics to you with the blunt honesty of a man who's made a fortune from other people's desperation. Everything out here costs 10 times what it should, he says, counting the evening's take from his establishment. But people pay it because they don't have a choice. You can't walk to the next town. It's 300 miles through country that'll kill you. So you pay what we charge, or you go without. The cattle trade that drives Dodge City's economy illustrates perfectly how frontier capitalism worked. Texas ranchers drive their herds north because they can sell cattle for $40 a head in Kansas that are worth only $4 in Texas. But the cowboys who do the actual work, driving thousands of cattle across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory, earn only $30 a month. And that's if they survive the journey and if their employers actually pay them. Many of the cowboys you see spending money in the saloons are actually broke. They're buying drinks and paying for entertainment with credit extended by saloon owners who know the cowboys will be back next season and will have to work off their debts. It's a system that keeps working men in perpetual debt while enriching the business owners who control credit and employment. The merchants who sell supplies to the cowboys and other transients operate on similar principles. John Bat Masterson runs a general store that extends credit at interest rates that would be considered criminal in more civilized places. Men buy supplies for their next job using money they hope to earn in the future, then find themselves working to pay off debts rather than to improve their circumstances. The women who work in the saloons and dance halls face even worse economic exploitation. Most are trapped in debt peonage systems where they owe money to madams for room, board, clothing, and protection. The prices charged for these necessities are inflated far beyond their actual cost, ensuring that the women remain in debt no matter how much they earn. A dress that costs $15 in the general store is charged to their account at $50. A meal worth 25 cents becomes $2 on their bill. Maddie Silks, who runs one of the more upscale brothels, is surprisingly frank about the economics of prostitution on the frontier. These girls don't have choices, she explains. Most came out here because they were running from something or someone. They've got no money, no family, no skills that pay decent wages for women. So they work for me, and I take care of them the best I can. But it's a hard business in a hard place. The legal system, such as it exists, is also driven by economic considerations rather than justice. Fines and court costs provide significant revenue for local officials, creating incentives to arrest people for minor infractions. A cowboy who gets drunk and disorderly might face fines totaling more than a month's wages, forcing him into debt or extended jail time that costs the community money they don't have. Sheriff Bat Masterson, who also serves as a justice of the Payos Peace, operates what amounts to a protection racket disguised as law enforcement. Businesses that pay regular fees for special protection find that their customers are rarely arrested for minor infractions. Those who don't pay find their patrons regularly hauled before Masterson's court on charges that carry heavy fines. The buffalo hunters who supply much of the area's meat and hides operate in an economy that's rapidly destroying itself. Buffalo that sold for $50 each 5 years ago now bring only $10. As overhunting has dramatically reduced the herds, many hunters are going broke, trying to find enough animals to make their expeditions profitable. But they continue hunting because they lack skills for other work and can't afford to start over somewhere else. Wyatt Earp, who will later become famous as a lawman but currently works as a buffalo hunter when he's not gambling, describes the economic trap that keeps men in dying industries. You know the buffalo won't last forever, but you need money today to eat and pay your debts. So you keep hunting, hoping to make one big score before it all ends. Meanwhile, you're getting deeper in debt and further from any other kind of life. the railroad workers who maintain the tracks and facilities that connect Dodge City to the outside world, earn steady wages by frontier standards. $40 a month, but they face working conditions that are often deadly. Track maintenance in extreme weather, with inadequate safety equipment, results in regular injuries and deaths that the railroad company accepts as normal business costs. The agricultural settlers who are beginning to arrive in the area face perhaps the worst economic prospects of all. They've paid inflated prices for land that may or may not be suitable for farming, invested their life savings in equipment and supplies that cost far more than they would in established agricultural areas, and committed themselves to making a living from soil and climate conditions they don't understand. Many of these farmers are immigrants who speak little English and have been sold land by unscrupulous speculators who made promises about soil quality and rainfall that have no basis in reality. They arrive to find that their prime agricultural land is actually semi-arid, prairie that can't support traditional farming methods, but they've spent everything they have and can't afford to leave. The general store ledgers tell the story of frontier economics in stark numbers. Most accounts show small purchases of basic necessities, coffee, flour, ammunition, bought on credit that accumulates faster than it can be paid off. People work constantly, but never seem to get ahead, always owing money for past purchases, while needing to buy today's necessities on credit that carries interest rates of 20 to 30% annually. By the end of your first day in Dodge City, you've begun to understand that the Wild West wasn't a land of opportunity for most people. It was an economic trap that exploited human desperation for the benefit of a few successful businessmen and speculators. The romantic notion of the frontier as a place where anyone could make a fresh start was true only for those who arrived with sufficient capital to avoid the debt traps that ensnared nearly everyone else. The cowboys, farmers, buffalo hunters, and other working people who actually built the West were systematically exploited by economic systems designed to extract maximum profit from their labor while keeping them too poor and indebted to escape. To better circumstances, this economic desperation was a major factor in the violence and social instability that characterized frontier life. People who are trapped in hopeless situations often resort to desperate measures. Your second day in Dodge City begins at 4:30 a.m., not by choice, but because the combination of heat, noise, and insect bites makes sleep impossible after that hour. The temperature in your shared hotel room is already approaching 80 degrees, and it will climb past 100 before noon. There's no air conditioning, no electric fans, not even adequate ventilation. The single window doesn't open properly, and the air outside is already stifling. The water you're offered for washing comes from a communal basin that's been used by several other guests and hasn't been changed. In days, it's tepid, murky, and has a metallic taste that suggests the container isn't properly cleaned. You quickly learn that personal hygiene in the Wild West isn't just difficult. It's often impossible under normal circumstances. Breakfast at the Dodge House consists of salt pork, beans, and coffee that tastes like it was made from burnt acorns. The milk is sour, if there's any milk at all. Fresh fruit and vegetables are rare luxuries that most people see only occasionally. When supply wagons arrive from more civilized areas, the diet that sustains most frontier residents is monotonous, nutritionally inadequate, and often contaminated with bacteria that cause chronic digestive problems. Martha Patterson, who cooks for the hotel, explains the challenges of frontier nutrition with the resignation of someone who's learned to work within impossible constraints. We serve what we can get, and we can get salt pork, beans, and flour most of the time. Sometimes we have eggs, if the chickens are laying and the coyotes haven't gotten them. Fresh meat when someone shoots something, but that spoils fast in this heat. The heat becomes unbearable by mid-morning, creating conditions that would be considered dangerous by modern standards. There's no effective way to cool buildings or provide relief from temperatures that regularly exceed 100 degrees. People work in direct sunlight, wearing heavy clothing because lighter fabrics aren't available or affordable. Heat stroke is common and often fatal, because medical treatment for overheating consists mainly of prayer and whatever folk remedies people remember from back east. Water is a constant concern that affects every aspect of daily life. The Arkansas River runs near Dodge City, but it's often too muddy to drink and may be contaminated by cattle, buffalo, and human waste from upstream sources. While water, when available, is often brackish and has a strong mineral taste that makes it barely palatable, many people rely on rainwater, collected in barrels, but Kansas rainfall is unpredictable, and stored water quickly becomes stagnant and infested with insects. Dr. Thomas McCarty, one of the few actual physicians in the area, describes the water situation with clinical despair. Half the illnesses I treat come from contaminated water. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera when it passes through. All waterborne diseases that kill people regularly because we can't guarantee clean drinking water. I tell people to boil everything, but fuel is expensive and time-consuming to gather. The insects are a constant torment that modern people can barely imagine. Flies cover everything edible within minutes of exposure. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds that make outdoor activity nearly impossible during evening hours. Bedbugs, lice, and fleas infest every building, every piece of clothing, every sleeping area. There are no effective repellents or treatments. People simply endure constant biting, itching, and the diseases that insects carry. Typhoid Mary O'Brien, a washerwoman who somehow survived multiple disease outbreaks, describes the insect problem with grim humor. You learn to eat fast before the flies take over your food. You learn to sleep when you're so tired you can ignore the bedbugs. You learn that scratching makes everything worse, but you scratch anyway because the itching drives you crazy. Sanitation is primitive in ways that create constant health hazards. There's no sewage system. Human waste is collected in outhouses that are emptied irregularly and often overflow during rainy periods. Garbage accumulates in the streets and empty lots, attracting rats and creating breeding grounds for disease. Animal waste from horses, cattle, and other livestock is everywhere. Adding to the general filth and smell, the medical care available would be considered barbaric by modern standards. Dr. McCarty is actually trained, which makes him unusual. Many frontier doctors are self-taught or learned their trade through brief apprenticeships. Treatment options are limited to whatever can be done with basic tools and whatever medicines can be transported across great distances without spoiling. Surgery is performed without anesthesia, antiseptics, or adequate lighting. Amputations are common because infected wounds can't be effectively treated with available antibiotics, because there are no antibiotics. Childbirth is extremely dangerous, with high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. Dental care consists mainly of tooth extraction with pliers, performed by whoever is brave enough to attempt it. The psychological stress of frontier life affects everyone, but is rarely acknowledged or treated. The constant threat of violence, disease, and economic disaster creates a baseline level of anxiety that would be considered pathological in safer environments. Many people turn to alcohol as their only available coping mechanism, which creates additional problems in a society where drunk men are armed and violence is accepted as normal. Mental illness is poorly understood and often handled through imprisonment or exile rather than treatment. People who break down under the stress of frontier life are considered weaklings rather than victims of impossible circumstances. Suicide is more common than most people admit, but it's usually attributed to other causes to avoid embarrassing families. Women face additional challenges that make their survival even more precarious. Pregnancy and childbirth without adequate medical care kill many women who would survive easily today. Domestic violence is common and rarely prosecuted. Women are considered property of their husbands or fathers, with few legal rights or protections. Economic opportunities for women are extremely limited, usually restricted to prostitution, laundry work, or cooking for boarding houses. Annie Lodwe, who runs a boarding house for railroad workers, describes women's survival strategies with hard-won wisdom. You learn to depend on yourself because you can't count on anyone else. You learn to fight when you have to, run when you can, and endure whatever you can avoid. The weak don't last long out here, and that's just the truth of it. Children suffer disproportionately in frontier conditions. Child mortality rates are staggering. Many families lose half their children before age 5 to diseases, accidents, and nutritional deficiencies. Education is sporadic or non-existent, leaving many children illiterate and unprepared for any life except manual labor. Child labor is routine and often dangerous because families need every possible source of income. The workday for most people begins before dawn and continues until well after dark because artificial lighting is expensive and inefficient. Manual labor is performed in extreme weather conditions without adequate safety equipment or protective clothing. Industrial accidents are common and often fatal because safety regulations don't exist and medical treatment for serious injuries is inadequate. By evening, when the temperature finally begins to drop below 90 degrees, you understand why so many people who came to the Wild West either died quickly or fled back east as soon as they could afford transportation. The daily struggle for survival in frontier conditions requires physical and mental toughness that few people possess, along with luck that can't be counted on. The romantic image of frontier life as an adventure where brave pioneers built a better future is largely mythology created by people who never experienced the reality. For most residents of places like Dodge City, daily life was a grinding struggle against heat, disease, violence, and economic exploitation that left little time or energy for anything beyond basic survival. Your third day in Dodge City is interrupted by gunfire at 8:17 a.m. Two cowboys who've been drinking since the previous evening have escalated a dispute over a card game into a shooting match in the middle of Front Street. By the time the smoke clears, one man is dead and another is wounded seriously enough that Dr. McCarty shakes his head grimly when examining him. The casual reaction of bystanders to this violence is more shocking than the shooting itself. People duck for cover during the actual gunfight, but within minutes of its conclusion, they're stepping over the dead body to continue their business. Children gather around to stare at the corpse with morbid curiosity. The saloon where the argument started reopens immediately, and customers step around the blood on the floor without comment. This is your introduction to the reality of violence in the Wild West. It's not the romanticized gunfights between heroes and villains that Hollywood would later portray, but rather brutal, sudden, often senseless killings that occur with such frequency that they become part of the background noise of daily life. Sheriff Bat Masterson arrives to investigate the shooting with the weary resignation of someone who's seen too many similar incidents. He takes statements from witnesses, examines the body, and files a brief report that will likely be the only official record of a man's death. There's no extensive investigation, no forensic evidence collection, no effort to determine whether the shooting was justified or criminal. Both men were armed. Both men were drunk. Both men were stupid. Masterson summarizes, one of them was a better shot. That's frontier justice for you. Quick, final, and not always fair. The dead man's body is dragged to an empty lot behind the barber shop, where it will remain until someone decides to pay for burial or until it becomes enough of a health hazard that the town council orders its disposal. The wounded man is taken to Dr. McCarty's office, where he'll either recover or die based on luck and the limited medical care available. Either way, the incident is considered closed. This casual attitude toward violence reflects the reality that frontier communities lack the resources, institutions, and social stability necessary for effective law enforcement or justice systems. With no professional police force, no criminal investigators, and minimal court systems, violent crimes were often handled through immediate retaliation, or simply ignored if the victims weren't important enough to matter. The weapons visible on every street corner tell their own story about the role of violence in frontier society. Nearly every adult male carries at least one firearm, usually a revolver, but often multiple weapons including knives, derringers, and rifles. These aren't ceremonial items or symbols of status. They're working tools that are used regularly for hunting, self-defense, and settling disputes. Luke Short, a professional gambler and occasional gunfighter, explains the practical necessity of being armed in frontier conditions. A man who can't defend himself won't last long out here. There's no police force to call when someone decides to rob you or kill you. The law is whatever you can enforce with your own weapons and skill. The quality and condition of these weapons varies dramatically based on their owner's economic circumstances. Wealthy cattle barons and successful businessmen carry expensive, well-maintained firearms that are reliable and accurate, working. Cowboys and manual laborers often make do with cheap, poorly maintained weapons that are as likely to misfire as to hit their intended targets. But the majority of violence in frontier towns doesn't involve gunfights between armed men facing each other in the street. Most violence is sudden, brutal, and one-sided. Ambushes, backstabbings, beatings administered by groups against individuals, and attacks on unarmed or defenseless victims. Women are particularly vulnerable to violence in frontier conditions, where they have few legal protections and limited recourse when attacked. Domestic violence is common and rarely prosecuted because women are considered property of their husbands with no independent legal standing. Sexual assault is widespread but seldom reported because victims face social stigma and legal systems that rarely convict perpetrators. The prostitutes who work in Dodge City saloons and brothels face constant threats of violence from customers, competitors, and law enforcement officials. Many carry weapons for self-defense, but their low social status means that violence against them is rarely investigated or prosecuted seriously. Racial and ethnic minorities face systematic violence that's often ignored or encouraged by local authorities. The few African Americans in Dodge City are subject to casual brutality that ranges from verbal abuse to physical assault and occasional lynching. Mexican workers are exploited economically and physically abused with impunity. Native Americans are shot on sight by many settlers who consider them subhuman. The economic motivations for violence create additional layers of danger for everyone. Robbery is common because many people carry significant amounts of cash and there are few secure storage options. Claim jumping, the violent seizure of mining or farming claims, is routine in areas where land ownership is disputed or poorly documented. Business disputes are often settled through intimidation and violence rather than legal processes. The buffalo hunters who work the plains around Dodge City live in a state of constant low-level warfare with Native American tribes who are defending their hunting grounds and way of life. These conflicts rarely make newspaper headlines, but they result in regular casualties on both sides and create an atmosphere of racial hatred that poisons relations between different groups. Professional gamblers like Luke Short and Doc Holliday represent a class of men who make their living through activities that routinely lead to violence. Gambling disputes are common triggers for fights that escalate quickly to deadly force. Accusations of cheating, whether true or false, often result in immediate violence that leaves men dead over card games worth a few dollars. The cattle drives that bring thousands of cowboys through Dodge City each season create periodic spikes in violence as men who've been isolated on the trail for months explode into alcohol-fueled rampages. These seasonal workers have few ties to the community and little stake in maintaining peaceful relations, making them particularly prone to destructive behavior. Law enforcement officials often contribute to the violence rather than controlling it. Many sheriffs and marshals are appointed based on their reputation for using violence effectively, rather than their commitment to justice or public safety. Pat Masterson, for example, is respected because he's quick with a gun and willing to kill when necessary, not because he's particularly interested in preventing crime or protecting innocent people. The judicial system, such as it exists, often encourages violence through its failure to provide effective alternatives. Men who might resolve disputes peacefully in more civilized areas resort to violence because they don't trust frontier courts to provide fair hearings or effective enforcement of judgments. Vigilante justice is common and often more popular than official law enforcement. When crimes are particularly heinous or when official authorities are considered ineffective, mobs form quickly to dispense immediate punishment. Lynchings, tar and feathering, and mob beatings are accepted forms of community justice that operate outside any legal framework. By the end of your third day in Dodge City, you've witnessed or heard about multiple acts of violence. The morning shooting, a stabbing in a gambling dispute, a beating administered to a man who couldn't pay his debts, and several minor assaults that were considered too routine to investigate. This level of violence is normal for frontier communities, where life is cheap and human conflict is resolved through force rather than negotiation. The romantic notion that frontier violence was noble or heroic, good men fighting evil men in fair fights with clear outcomes, bears no resemblance to the reality you've observed. Most violence is sudden, brutal, and pointless, usually resulting from alcohol, desperation, or simple human stupidity, rather than any grand moral struggle. The smell reaches you before you see its source. The sickly sweet odor of decay mixed with carbolic acid and human waste. Following your nose leads you to Dr. McCarty's makeshift hospital, a converted storage room behind his office where the seriously ill and injured await either recovery or death in conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Inside the dim, stuffy room, 6 men lie on crude cots made from wooden boards and straw mattresses. Their conditions represent a catalog of frontier medical horrors: gangrene from an infected gunshot wound, typhoid fever that's been raging for 2 weeks, dysentery so severe the patient has lost consciousness from dehydration, a broken leg that was set improperly and is now infected, and 2 cases of what Dr. McCarty calls prairie fever, but can't identify more specifically. The medical care available consists mainly of prayer, laudanum for pain, and whatever folk remedies Dr. McCarty remembers from his limited training. There are no antibiotics, no antiseptics beyond carbolic acid, no anesthesia except alcohol and opium derivatives, and no understanding of germ theory or infection control. Surgery is performed with tools that aren't properly sterilized, in rooms that aren't adequately clean, by a man whose medical knowledge wouldn't qualify him to work as a veterinarian today. I do what I can with what I have. Dr. McCarty explains while examining a cowboy whose arm was mangled in a horse accident. But mostly I just try to keep people comfortable while their bodies decide whether they're going to live or die. Modern medicine hasn't reached places like Dodge City yet, and it may not for years. The diseases that kill people regularly in frontier towns are ones that would be easily treatable or preventable today. Cholera outbreaks occur periodically, killing dozens of people within weeks through dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Typhoid fever spreads through contaminated water supplies, causing high fevers, severe diarrhea, and death rates approaching 30%. Dysentery is endemic, weakening people and making them susceptible to other infections. Smallpox, despite the availability of vaccination, kills regularly because many people can't afford the vaccine or don't trust medical procedures. Tuberculosis spreads rapidly in crowded, poorly ventilated buildings, causing slow, wasting deaths that can take months or years. Pneumonia kills quickly, especially during winter months when people lack adequate heating and nutrition. Childhood diseases that are routine in modern times were often fatal on the frontier. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, and diphtheria killed significant percentages of children who contracted them. Many families lost multiple children to diseases that vaccines would later prevent. Infant mortality was so high that many parents didn't name their children until they were several months old and likely to survive. Accidents that would be minor injuries today often became death sentences in frontier conditions. A simple cut could become infected and lead to gangrene that required amputation. If the patient was lucky, broken bones that weren't set properly could become infected or heal incorrectly, leaving people permanently disabled. Burns from cooking, fires, or lamp accidents often became infected and caused slow, agonizing deaths. Childbirth was extraordinarily dangerous for both mothers and infants. Without sterile conditions, adequate medical equipment, or trained midwives, many women died from infection, hemorrhaging, or complications that would be easily managed today. Infant mortality during birth was high, and many babies who survived birth died within their first year from preventable diseases or nutritional deficiencies. Mental illness was poorly understood and often handled through imprisonment, exile, or simply ignoring people who couldn't function normally. The stress of frontier life created many cases of what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety disorders. But these conditions were usually attributed to moral weakness or character flaws rather than medical problems. Sarah McKinney, a widow who survived multiple epidemic outbreaks, describes the impact of disease on frontier families with the stoic acceptance of someone who's seen too much death. You learn not to get too attached to people, especially children, because death comes quick and often out here. I've buried 3 husbands and 5 children, and I know families that have lost more than that. The primitive burial practices reflect both the high death rate and the limited resources available for dealing with corpses. Most people are buried in simple, wooden boxes in unmarked graves, often in locations that aren't properly surveyed or protected. During epidemic outbreaks, bodies are sometimes buried in mass graves or simply left in remote locations when proper burial becomes impossible. The psychological impact of constant exposure to death affects everyone, but is rarely acknowledged or addressed. People develop emotional numbness as a survival mechanism, but this often manifests as callousness or cruelty that makes frontier society seem particularly harsh. Children who grow up seeing death regularly often develop disturbed attitudes toward violence and human suffering. Alcoholism is widespread and often represents the only available treatment for chronic pain, mental illness, or emotional trauma. Patent medicines containing high percentages of alcohol or opium are consumed regularly by people seeking relief from conditions that can't be properly diagnosed or treated. Addiction to these substances creates additional health problems and contributes to the social instability that characterizes frontier communities. Nutritional diseases affect almost everyone to some degree. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C is common among people who can't afford fresh fruits and vegetables. Rickets affects children whose diets lack adequate calcium and vitamin D. Pellagra from niacin deficiency causes skin problems, digestive issues, and mental symptoms that are often misdiagnosed. As other conditions, the working conditions that most people endure create ongoing health problems that accumulate over time. Manual laborers develop arthritis, back problems, and repetitive stress injuries that become progressively worse without adequate treatment. Miners suffer from lung diseases caused by inhaling dust and toxic substances. Farmers develop skin cancer from constant sun exposure and respiratory problems from working with dusty grain and hay. Women's health issues are particularly poorly addressed because of social taboos surrounding female anatomy and reproduction. Gynecological problems are rarely treated by qualified physicians, often leading to chronic pain, infection, and complications that affect women's ability to work and care for families. Birth control is unavailable or unreliable, leading to frequent pregnancies that weaken women's health and increase the risk of death in childbirth. Dental care is essentially non-existent, beyond tooth extraction with crude tools and no anesthesia. Most adults lose many or all of their teeth by middle age, affecting their ability to eat properly and contributing to nutritional deficiencies. Dental abscesses kill people regularly when infections spread to other parts of the body. The medicine. Men and folk healers who serve communities without trained physicians often do more harm than good, despite their good intentions. Treatments based on superstition rather than medical knowledge can delay effective treatment or actually worsen conditions. However, in the absence of trained doctors, these practitioners provide the only medical care available to many people. By your fourth day in Dodge City, you've witnessed deaths from gunshot wounds, disease, accidents, and medical treatment that was worse than no treatment at all. The cemetery on the outskirts of town is filling rapidly with graves of people who died from causes that would be easily preventable or treatable today. The harsh reality is that life expectancy in frontier conditions was significantly lower than in more civilized areas, not because of dramatic shootouts, but because of the constant attrition from disease, accidents, and inadequate medical care. Most people who came to the Wild West expecting to build better lives found instead that they were gambling their health and longevity against uncertain economic opportunities in an environment that was actively hostile to human survival. The sound of splintering wood wakes you at 2 a.m. as Sheriff Bat Masterson kicks in the door of the room next to yours. The occupant, a cowboy named Jake Morrison, who won big at poker earlier in the evening, is dragged from his bed and arrested on charges of disturbing the peace and public intoxication, even though he's been quietly sleeping for hours. Court's in session at 8 sharp, Masterson informs Morrison while shackling him. Judge will want to see that poker money as evidence, and court costs run about $50 for cases like this. This is your introduction to frontier justice, a system that operates more like organized extortion than actual law enforcement. The legal framework that exists serves primarily to generate revenue for local officials and protect the interests of established businessmen rather than maintain order or protect citizens' rights. The next morning, you attend Morrison's trial in what passes for Dodge City's courthouse, a room above the barbershop where Masterson serves as both sheriff and justice of the peace. There's no jury, no defense attorney, and no presumption of innocence. Morrison is charged with multiple crimes he didn't commit, fine amounts that exceed his poker winnings, and given the choice between paying immediately or spending 30 days in jail. Justice is efficient out here, Masterson explains while counting Morrison's money. We don't have time for lengthy trials and appeals. A man breaks the law, he pays the penalty, simple as that. The law that Masterson enforces bears little resemblance to constitutional principles or due process rights. It's a collection of local ordinances designed to maximize fine revenue, personal grudges disguised as criminal charges, and arbitrary decisions based on the sheriff's mood and financial needs. The legal system exists to serve those who control it rather than those who are subject to it. Property rights, supposedly fundamental to American law, are essentially meaningless in frontier conditions. Land ownership is often disputed or fraudulent, with competing claims backed by forged documents or outright violence. Mining claims are jumped regularly, with disputes settled by whoever has more men and better weapons rather than legal procedures. Business contracts are rarely enforceable, because there are no reliable courts to adjudicate disputes and no effective mechanisms for collecting judgments. Partnerships often end in violence when one party decides to dissolve the arrangement unilaterally. Debts are collected through intimidation and force rather than legal processes. The few lawyers who practice in frontier towns are often more crooked than the criminals they supposedly defend or prosecute. They work closely with local officials to fleece travelers and newcomers through fraudulent legal proceedings. Justice is available to whoever can pay the highest bribes or threaten the most effective violence. Judge Roy Bean, who holds court in nearby Langtry, Texas, epitomizes frontier legal practice. He dispenses justice based on his personal whims. The amount of money involved and his relationships with the parties, his legal decisions are creative interpretations of law that serve his financial interests rather than established legal principles. The law is whatever I say it is, Bean explains when questioned about his unusual procedures. I've got the only law book within 300 miles, and most people can't read it anyway. They want justice, they get Roy Bean justice, and that's good enough. For them, the territorial and federal legal systems that theoretically govern frontier areas are largely absent from daily life. Federal marshals rarely visit places like Dodge City, and when they do, they're more interested in collecting fees and bribes than enforcing actual laws. Territorial courts are too distant and expensive for most people to access, leaving local officials free to operate however they choose. Civil rights, as understood in more civilized areas, don't exist on the frontier. Freedom of speech is limited to whatever doesn't offend local power brokers. Freedom of assembly is restricted to activities that don't threaten established interests. Property rights exist only for those who can defend them through force. Due process is a foreign concept in frontier legal proceedings. Searches and seizures are conducted based on suspicion, personal animosity, or simple greed rather than legal warrants. Arrests are made to collect fines rather than prevent crimes. Trials are conducted without regard for rules of evidence or constitutional protections. The law enforcement officers who patrol frontier towns are often more dangerous than the criminals they're supposed to control. Many are appointed based on their willingness to use violence rather than their commitment to justice. They supplement their incomes through extortion, gambling, and various criminal enterprises. Wyatt Earp, who will later become famous as a lawman, currently operates in a gray area between law enforcement and criminal activity. He works as a part-time deputy when it suits his purposes, but he also runs gambling operations, collects debts for local businessmen, and engages in various questionable activities that would be illegal if anyone with authority cared to investigate. The badge is just another tool for making money, Earp explains while dealing cards in a poker game. Sometimes it's useful for intimidating people or getting cooperation. Sometimes it gets in the way of business. You use it when it helps and ignore it when it doesn't. The prison facilities available for serious criminals are so primitive that they're often more dangerous than release. The local jail is a crude wooden building with no security, no sanitation, and no supervision. Prisoners who can't pay fines are often released simply because maintaining them costs more than their labor is worth. Legal proceedings often become violent confrontations when one party decides that shooting opponents is more effective than arguing with them. Courtrooms are armed camps where lawyers, judges, and litigants carry weapons and use them when legal arguments fail to produce desired results. The appeals process, fundamental to civilized legal systems, doesn't exist in frontier conditions. Decisions made by local officials are final. Regardless of their legality or fairness, people who feel wronged by legal proceedings have no recourse. Except violence or exile, civil law, the framework that governs contracts, property rights, and business relationships, is essentially non-functional in frontier conditions. Agreements are enforced through personal relationships and mutual benefit. Rather than legal compulsion, partnerships rely on trust and mutual intimidation rather than written contracts. Marriage and family law reflect the frontier's casual attitude toward legal niceties. Marriages are often informal arrangements without official documentation. Divorces are accomplished by one party leaving town permanently. Child custody is determined by whoever can provide for or control the children rather than legal procedures. Racial and ethnic minorities have no legal protections and little access to justice. When wronged by white settlers, Native Americans are considered enemies rather than citizens with rights. African Americans face systematic discrimination that's often enforced through violence. Mexican workers are exploited without legal recourse. Women have virtually no legal rights independent of their husbands or fathers. They can't vote, can't own property, can't enter contracts, and can't seek legal protection from domestic violence. The legal system treats them as property rather than citizens with rights. By your fifth day in Dodge City, you've observed a legal system that operates primarily for the benefit of those who control it rather than the people it supposedly serves. Justice is a commodity that's bought and sold like any other, available to those who can afford it and denied to those who can't. The romanticized image of frontier lawmen as heroic figures defending civilization against chaos bears no resemblance to the reality you've witnessed. Most law enforcement officials are opportunists who use their badges to enrich themselves and settle personal scores, rather than protect public safety or maintain order. The absence of effective legal institutions creates an environment where might makes right, where disputes are settled through violence rather than negotiation, and where ordinary people have little protection against exploitation by those with more money, better weapons, or stronger political connections. The woman who approaches you on Front Street at midday is missing 3 fingers from her left hand, has a purple bruise covering half her face, and walks with a limp that suggests a recently broken bone that didn't heal properly. Her dress, which might have been blue or gray originally, is now the color of prairie dust and has been mended so many times that more of it is patches than original fabric. "You look like you might have money," she says with a gap-toothed smile that's somehow more heartbreaking than seductive. "I'm Lily, and I can show you a real good time for $2, or $1 if you ain't particular about location." This is your introduction to the reality of women's lives in the Wild West, a reality that bears no resemblance to the romanticized images of beautiful saloon girls and pioneering wives that popular culture would later create. The women of the frontier lived lives of desperation, exploitation, and constant danger that few modern people could endure or even imagine. Lily's story, which she tells while sharing a bottle of whiskey in her cramped room above a saloon, illustrates the economic and social forces that trapped women in impossible situations. She came to Kansas from Ohio with her husband and 2 children, hoping to claim farmland under the Homestead Act. Her husband died of cholera during their second winter, leaving her with no money, no skills that paid decent wages, and 2 young children to support. "I tried taking in laundry, but there ain't enough customers to make a living," she explains while showing you the infected cuts on her hands from washing clothes in lye soap. "I tried cooking for the boarding house, but they only paid 50 cents a week and expected me to work 16 hours a day. This pays better, and at least I can usually feed my kids." Prostitution represents one of the few economic opportunities available to women on the frontier, but it's hardly the glamorous life portrayed in Western movies. The women who work in Dodge City's brothels and saloons face constant threats of violence from customers, disease from lack of medical care, and exploitation from madams who keep them in debt bondage through inflated charges for room, board, and protection. The working conditions would be considered criminal today. Women service multiple customers per day in rooms that aren't cleaned between clients, without protection against sexually transmitted diseases, and often while intoxicated on alcohol or laudanum to make the work bearable. Violence from customers is routine and rarely punished. Because prostitutes have no legal protections and little recourse when assaulted. Maddie Silks, who operates one of the more upscale establishments, describes the business with cold realism. These girls don't have choices. Most are running from something. Abusive husbands, criminal charges, families that threw them out. They've got no money, no education, and no skills that pay enough to live on. So they work for me. I take care of them the best I can, but it's a hard business. In a hard place. The respectable married women who live in frontier towns face different but equally challenging circumstances. Most are isolated from other women, overworked to the point of exhaustion, and subject to domestic violence that's considered normal and acceptable. They bear children frequently without adequate medical care, lose many of those children to disease and accidents, and often die young from the cumulative effects of constant childbearing and hard physical labor. Mary Catherine Hironi, who came to Kansas with her merchant husband, describes frontier marriage with weary acceptance. A woman's job is to work from before sunrise until after dark, bear children every year or two, bury the ones that don't survive, and keep her mouth shut about whatever her husband chooses to do. If you are lucky, he doesn't beat you too bad and brings home enough money to buy food. The domestic violence that affects frontier women is systematic and severe, but it's rarely acknowledged as a problem because women are considered property of their husbands with no independent rights. Beatings are accepted as normal methods of marital discipline. Sexual assault within marriage isn't recognized as a crime. Women who leave abusive husbands face social ostracism and economic destitution. The few women who attempt to operate independent businesses face systematic discrimination and often outright sabotage from male competitors. Female merchants are charged higher prices for wholesale goods, denied credit that's routinely extended to men, and harassed by customers who don't believe women should work outside traditional domestic roles. Sarah Bowman, who attempts to run a restaurant, explains the obstacles she faces. Men don't want to take orders from a woman, even about what they want for dinner. They expect lower prices because they think a woman's work isn't worth as much. And if you're successful, they'll find ways to drive you out of business because they don't want the competition. The women who accompany wagon trains or live on isolated homesteads face additional dangers from hostile Native American tribes, wild animals, and the complete absence of medical care or assistance when emergencies arise. Many die in childbirth because there's no one available to help with complications. Others succumb to diseases that would be treatable if medical care were available. The mail-order brides who travel to the frontier to marry men they've never met often find themselves trapped in situations that range from unpleasant to life-threatening. Many discover that their intended husbands misrepresented their financial circumstances, personal character, or physical condition. Some find themselves essentially sold into slavery disguised as marriage. Anna Peterson, a Swedish immigrant who answered a newspaper advertisement for a wife, describes her disillusionment. He said he was a successful rancher with a nice house. When I got here, I found out he was a failed farmer living in a sod house with holes in the roof. He expected me to work like a slave and bear children like an animal. When I tried to leave, he said I owed him money for my train ticket and couldn't go until I worked it off. The educational opportunities available to women are virtually non-existent, beyond basic literacy, and even that is considered unnecessary by many frontier families. Girls are expected to work from early childhood, helping with domestic duties, caring for younger siblings, and contributing to family income however possible. Most receive no formal education and remain illiterate throughout their lives. Legal rights for women are minimal to non-existent. They can't vote, can't own property independently, can't enter contracts, and can't seek legal protection from domestic violence. In court proceedings, their testimony is given less weight than men's, and they're often not allowed to testify at all in cases involving their husbands. The psychological toll of frontier life on women is severe, but rarely acknowledged. The isolation, overwork, constant childbearing, and frequent loss of children create high rates of what would now be recognized as depression and anxiety disorders. Many women turn to patent medicines containing alcohol or opium as their only available coping mechanism. Medical care specifically for women's health issues is almost non-existent and often dangerous when available. Childbirth is attended by midwives with no formal training or by male doctors who consider gynecological problems embarrassing to discuss. Many women die from complications that would be easily treatable today. The social isolation experienced by frontier women is particularly severe because communities are scattered. Transportation is difficult, and domestic duties leave little time for social interaction. Many women go months without seeing other women, leading to loneliness and depression that compounds the other hardships they face. By your 6th day in Dodge City, you've encountered enough women to understand that their experiences of frontier life are generally worse than men's, with fewer opportunities, greater dangers, and virtually no legal or social protections. The romanticized image of strong pioneer. Women building civilization alongside their husbands is largely mythology that ignores the systematic oppression and exploitation that characterized most women's frontier experiences. The women who survived and occasionally thrived in frontier conditions were extraordinarily tough and resourceful, but their success came despite the social and economic systems that worked against them rather than because of opportunities that frontier life provided. Most women who came to the Wild West found their lives constrained by poverty, violence, and social limitations that were often worse than what they'd left behind in more civilized areas. On your 7th day in Dodge City, you encounter a traveling photographer who's documenting frontier life for Eastern newspapers and magazines. His staged photographs tell a story that bears no resemblance to the reality you've been experiencing. Clean cowboys posing heroically with gleaming weapons. Attractive women in elaborate costumes that no working frontier woman could afford. And picturesque saloons that look nothing like the crude drinking establishments you've visited. People back east want to see adventure and romance, the photographer explains while arranging a group of locals for another pose shot. They don't want to hear about dysentery and economic exploitation, so I give them what they want. The Wild West as it should be, not as it is. This is your introduction to the mythology-making process that would eventually transform the brutal reality of frontier life into the romanticized Western legends that still persist today. Even as the actual events were happening, writers, photographers, and promoters were creating fictional versions that emphasized excitement and heroism, while ignoring the suffering and degradation that characterized most people's experiences. The dime novels that are already being written about frontier life bear no resemblance to what you've witnessed. The heroes are noble cowboys who always fight fair, protect innocent people, and triumph over clearly evil villains. The reality you've observed involves desperate people fighting over scraps, good and evil distributed randomly among all participants, and most conflicts ending badly for everyone involved. Buffalo Bill Cody, who's building a career as a frontier entertainer, visits Dodge City to recruit performers for his Wild West show. The version of frontier life he's creating for Eastern audiences emphasizes spectacular gunfights, exotic native Americans, and daring horsemen performing amazing feats. It's entertainment designed to thrill people who've never experienced the genuine hardships of frontier existence. The real West is too dirty and depressing for show business, Cody admits. While reviewing potential performers, people want to see adventure and excitement, not dysentery and desperation. So we give them cowboys and Indians fighting dramatic battles, not the reality of cultures destroying each other through disease and economic warfare. The newspapers that report on frontier events consistently emphasize sensational violence while ignoring the mundane suffering that affects most residents. A single gunfight that kills one person generates more coverage than epidemic diseases that kill dozens. Dramatic stagecoach robberies get front-page treatment while the economic exploitation that drives most people to desperation receives no attention. The political rhetoric used to promote Western settlement emphasizes opportunity and freedom while carefully avoiding mention of the mortality rates, economic exploitation, and social chaos that characterize actual frontier conditions. Government promoters describe rich farmland and abundant opportunities without mentioning the droughts, crop failures, and debt cycles that destroy most agricultural settlers. Railroad companies that profit from Western migration produce elaborate promotional materials showing prosperous farms, thriving towns, and happy families enjoying the fruits of frontier life. These advertisements carefully avoid showing the abandoned homesteads, ghost towns, and broken families that represent the more common outcomes of Western migration. The religious and moral organizations that support Western expansion frame frontier settlement as a noble effort to spread civilization and Christianity to wilderness areas. This narrative ignores the systematic destruction of Native American cultures, the exploitation of immigrant laborers, and the moral degradation that occurs when civilized institutions break down under frontier conditions. The business interests that profit from frontier development, cattle barons, mining companies, railroad corporations actively promote mythologized versions of Western life to attract workers and investors. Their promotional materials emphasize individual success stories, while ignoring the high failure rates and dangerous working conditions that characterize most frontier industries. The women who write back to family and friends in the East often perpetuate frontier myths because admitting the reality would be too devastating for their self-image and family relationships. Letters home describe adventure and opportunity while carefully omitting details about violence, disease, and economic desperation. The men who return to Eastern communities after frontier experiences often embellish their stories to make themselves seem heroic rather than simply lucky to have survived. Their accounts emphasize dramatic confrontations with outlaws and Indians while downplaying the dysentery, boredom, and financial failure that characterized most of their actual experiences. Even the physical appearance of frontier towns is artificially enhanced for visitors and photographers. Building facades are constructed to look impressive from the street while hiding the crude reality behind them. Streets are occasionally cleaned, and businesses temporarily upgraded when important visitors are expected. The legal system promotes frontier myths by treating sensational crimes as more important than systematic problems. A notorious outlaw who kills a few people in dramatic fashion becomes famous, while the business practices that impoverish thousands of people are ignored or actively protected by law enforcement. The weapons and fighting techniques that become legendary bear little resemblance to the reality of frontier violence. The quick-draw gunfights that capture public imagination almost never occur in real life, where most shooting involves ambush, accidents, or drunken brawls. The skilled gunfighters who become famous are usually lucky survivors rather than supremely skilled marksmen. The economic relationships that actually drive frontier development, debt peonage, corporate exploitation, and systematic fraud are carefully hidden behind romantic narratives about individual enterprise and free market capitalism. The reality that most wealth is accumulated through exploitation rather than productive work doesn't fit popular narratives about American opportunity. The racial and ethnic conflicts that characterize frontier life are simplified into dramatic stories about cowboys and Indians that ignore the complex economic and cultural factors that drive these conflicts. The systematic genocide of Native American populations is transformed into stories about brave pioneers defending themselves against savage attacks. The role of alcohol and drug abuse in frontier society is minimized or romanticized in popular accounts that portray drinking as harmless recreation rather than the desperate escapism that it represents for most frontier residents. The reality that many people are functional alcoholics or drug addicts doesn't fit images of rugged individualism and healthy outdoor life. The environmental destruction caused by frontier development, overhunting that eliminates wildlife populations, mining that pollutes water supplies, and farming that causes massive soil erosion, is ignored in favor of narratives about humans conquering nature and making the wilderness productive. By your final day in Dodge City, you understand that the mythology surrounding the Wild West was being created even as the actual events were occurring. The people who profited from frontier development had strong incentives to promote romanticized versions that would attract more workers, settlers, and investors, while hiding the reality that would discourage further migration. The gap between myth and reality is so enormous that they seem like descriptions of completely different places and times. The Wild West of popular imagination is a place of adventure, opportunity, and heroic individualism. The Wild West you've experienced is a place of suffering, exploitation, and systematic brutality that destroyed most of the people who encountered it. Understanding this gap is crucial for comprehending how American frontier mythology developed and why it persists despite abundant historical evidence that contradicts its basic premises. The myths serve important psychological and political functions that have little to do with historical accuracy, but everything to do with how Americans want to see themselves and their national history. Your final morning in Dodge City begins with a revelation that puts everything you've witnessed into stark perspective. While reviewing the account books for the Dodge House Hotel, you discover the true financial structure that underlies Frontier Opportunity, a systematic exploitation machine designed to extract maximum profit from human desperation while maintaining the illusion of economic freedom. The numbers tell a story that contradicts every myth about frontier prosperity. The hotel's records show that 70% of guests leave owing money they can't pay, forcing them into debt relationships that effectively enslave them to local creditors. Cowboys who arrive with wages from cattle drives leave deeper in debt than when they arrived, having spent their earnings on overpriced goods and services while accumulating additional debt for basic necessities. James "Dog" Kelly, who owns much of Front Street, explains the system with the casual honesty of someone who's perfected it over years of practice. The secret is to never let anyone get ahead. You extend credit when they're broke, charge interest they can't afford, and keep them working to pay off debts that grow faster than they can pay them down. It's not personal. It's just business. This debt peonage system operates throughout frontier society, trapping workers in cycles of indebtedness that make escape impossible. The cattle ranchers who employ cowboys advance money for equipment and supplies at inflated prices, then deduct those costs from wages at harvest time. Most cowboys discover they owe more than they've earned, forcing them to sign on for another season to work off their debts. The mining companies operate similar systems on a larger scale. Workers are housed in company towns where they must purchase all goods from company stores at prices that exceed their wages. Safety equipment, tools, and even basic food items are charged to worker accounts at rates that ensure permanent indebtedness. Miners who try to leave are told they owe thousands of dollars for advances and equipment costs. The railroad construction crews face perhaps the worst exploitation. Immigrant workers who speak little English are recruited with promises of good wages and free transportation, only to discover that they owe money for travel expenses, tools, and living costs that exceed their earnings. Many work for months without seeing any actual money, accumulating debt instead of wages. The agricultural settlers who arrive hoping to claim free land under the Homestead Act quickly discover that free land requires significant cash investments for equipment, seed, livestock, and supplies. Local merchants extend credit for these necessities at interest rates that make repayment virtually impossible, especially given the unpredictable weather and market conditions that characterize frontier farming. The women who work in frontier establishments face particularly severe economic exploitation. Prostitutes are charged for room, board, clothing, medical care, and protection at rates that keep them permanently indebted to their employers. Even successful women find that their earnings are consumed by inflated charges for basic necessities. The legal system actively supports these exploitative arrangements by recognizing debt contracts while ignoring labor protections. Courts routinely order the seizure of property to satisfy debts, but they rarely investigate whether those debts were legitimately incurred or fairly calculated. The law protects creditors while offering no recourse for workers who've been defrauded. Local government officials profit directly from this system through fees, fines, and kickbacks that supplement their official salaries. Sheriff Masterson earns more from court costs and confiscated property than from his law enforcement duties. Justice of the peace courts generates significant revenue by finding travelers and workers guilty of infractions that carry heavy fines. The monopolistic nature of frontier commerce eliminates competition that might provide workers with alternatives. In many areas, a single company or individual controls employment, housing, retail goods, and credit, making it impossible for workers to shop around for better terms or conditions. This vertical integration ensures that all money flows upward to a small number of business owners. The transportation monopolies operated by railroad companies allow them to charge whatever rates the market will bear for moving goods and people. These charges are ultimately passed on to consumers and workers, who pay inflated prices for everything they buy while receiving reduced wages that account for transportation costs. The banking and credit systems that develop in frontier areas are designed to benefit lenders rather than borrowers. Interest rates of 20 to 50% annually are common, and loan terms often include clauses that allow lenders to seize collateral for minor technical violations. Many borrowers discover that they've signed agreements they can't read or understand, committing themselves to terms that make repayment impossible. The insurance and bonding systems that theoretically protect workers often function as additional sources of exploitation. Workers are required to pay for insurance policies that rarely pay claims when injuries or deaths occur. The fine print in these policies usually excludes coverage for the very hazards that make frontier work dangerous. The political corruption that characterizes frontier government ensures that exploitative business practices receive official protection rather than regulation. Local officials are often business partners with the merchants and employers they're supposed to regulate. Complaints about unfair treatment are dismissed or result in retaliation against workers who dare to speak up. The seasonal nature of much frontier employment creates additional opportunities for exploitation. Workers who are employed only during cattle driving season or harvest time find themselves unemployed for months but unable to leave the area because they owe money to local creditors. This captive workforce can be employed at below subsistence wages because workers have no alternatives. The ethnic and racial divisions among frontier workers are deliberately encouraged by employers who use prejudice to prevent collective action. Irish, German, Mexican, and Chinese workers are played against each other through differential treatment that prevents them from recognizing their common interests in opposing exploitative conditions. The mythology of individual opportunity and self-reliance that surrounds frontier life serves to justify systematic exploitation by suggesting that poverty and debt result from personal failures rather than structural problems. Workers who complain about unfair treatment are told they lack the pioneer spirit or moral character necessary for frontier success. The educational and information systems that exist in frontier areas are controlled by the same interests that profit from worker exploitation. Newspapers, schools, and other sources of information promote narratives that justify existing economic arrangements while suppressing information that might help workers understand their situation or organize for better conditions. The religious institutions that serve frontier communities often preach acceptance of economic hardship as God's will, while teaching that wealth accumulation by business owners represents divine blessing. This ideological framework helps maintain social stability while discouraging workers from questioning exploitative arrangements. Your week in Dodge City concludes with the recognition that the Wild West was not a land of opportunity for most people who participated in it, but rather a carefully orchestrated system for extracting wealth from human desperation. The romantic myths that surrounded frontier life were created and promoted by the very people who profited from the exploitation of workers, settlers, and other vulnerable populations. The individuals who became wealthy during the frontier era, cattle barons, mining magnates, railroad tycoons, and land speculators, did so not through superior character or harder work, but through their ability to systematically exploit the labor and resources of others, while using legal and political systems to protect their advantages. The vast majority of people who participated in frontier development, cowboys, miners, farmers, railroad workers, and others, found themselves trapped in economic relationships that left them poorer and more desperate than when they started. Their suffering and exploitation provided the foundation for fortunes that would be passed down through generations of American elite families. Understanding this economic reality is essential for comprehending why frontier life was so brutal, and why so many people who came to the Wild West either died, fled, or remained trapped in poverty, despite working in industries that generated enormous wealth for their employers. The Wild West was wild primarily because it operated outside the legal and social constraints that protected workers in more civilized areas. As the westbound train that brought you to Dodge City prepares for its return journey to Kansas City, you join the line of passengers eager to escape frontier life. The crowd waiting to board includes broken men who've lost everything to frontier economics, women fleeing abusive situations, families bankrupted by failed farming ventures, and workers who've discovered that frontier opportunity means exploitation and early death. The conductor, a man who's made this route hundreds of times, surveys the departing passengers with knowing eyes. A lot more folks heading east than west these days, he observes. Word's getting out about what it's really like out here. The smart ones leave before it kills them. Your fellow passengers represent a catalog of frontier failures. The family in the seat across from you lost their homestead to drought and debt after 3 years of back-breaking labor. The woman with the bandaged face is fleeing a husband who considered beating her a normal part of marriage. The young man with the missing fingers lost them in a mining accident and was fired for being unable to work effectively with his remaining digits. As the train pulls away from Dodge City, you watch the town recede into the distance with a mixture of relief and horror. The week you've spent there has shown you a side of American history that bears no resemblance to the romantic myths that surround the frontier experience. You've witnessed systematic brutality, economic exploitation, and human degradation on a scale that would be shocking in any era. The reality of life in the Wild West, the constant threat of disease and violence, the grinding poverty that affected most residents, the absence of basic amenities that make life bearable, the exploitation of desperate people by those with capital and power, explains why so many people who came west either died quickly or fled as soon as they could afford transportation back to civilization. The myths that would later surround the frontier era, stories of heroic cowboys, noble settlers, and opportunities for advancement through hard work and moral character, were created by people who profited from frontier development and needed to attract workers, settlers, and investors to sustain their enterprises. These myths served economic and political purposes that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. The passengers on your eastbound train carry with them stories that contradict every frontier myth. But most will never tell those stories because admitting the reality would be too devastating to their self-image and too discouraging to friends and family who might be considering their own Western adventures. The gap between frontier mythology and frontier reality represents more than simple historical misunderstanding. It reflects the power of economic interests to shape cultural narratives in ways that serve their purposes rather than historical truth. The Wild West myths persist because they serve psychological and political needs that have nothing to do with what actually happened in places like Dodge City. As your train crosses back into more civilized territory, you begin to see the infrastructure that makes normal life possible. Paved roads, adequate housing, schools, hospitals, and other institutions that provide security and opportunity for ordinary people. The contrast with frontier conditions makes clear why most people who experienced both chose civilization over the supposed freedom of frontier life. The Wild West you experienced was wild primarily because it lacked the social, legal, and economic institutions that protect people from exploitation and provide opportunities for genuine advancement. The absence of these institutions created conditions where human life was cheap, suffering was routine, and most people who participated in frontier development paid a terrible price for the enrichment of a few successful businessmen and speculators. Your week in Dodge City has taught you that the real story of the American frontier is not about brave pioneers building a better society through individual effort and moral character, but about the systematic exploitation of desperate people by those who controlled capital and political power. Understanding this reality is essential for comprehending both American history and the persistent myths that continue to shape American politics and culture. The train carries you back toward a world where law enforcement serves justice rather than business interests, where economic systems provide genuine opportunities rather than debt traps, where medical care is available to treat routine illnesses, and where social institutions protect vulnerable people rather than exploiting them. As Dodge City disappears behind you, you carry with you the knowledge that the Wild West was harder than most people could imagine, not because of dramatic confrontations with outlaws and Indians, but because of the brutal daily reality of life in a society that had abandoned the civilized institutions that make human flourishing possible. The romantic myths that surround the frontier era will persist, but you now understand that they represent propaganda rather than history, designed to serve the interests of those who profited from frontier development rather than to honor the memory of those who suffered and died to make that development possible. The stench that greeted you upon arrival in Dodge City, the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and human waste baking in the sun, lingers in your memory as a more accurate symbol of frontier life than any Hollywood Western could ever provide. It's the smell of a society that had abandoned the basic decencies that make civilization possible, leaving ordinary people to struggle for survival in conditions that were often worse than what they'd left behind. Your journey into the real Wild West is over, but the knowledge you've gained about the gap between American myths and American realities will inform your understanding of history, politics, and human nature for the rest of your life. You now know what life was really like in the Wild West, and that knowledge changes everything.